It's the 6th of June 2016. My name is KerryPinny. I'm a digital education developer at the University of Lincoln. HE policy making means very little to me. It's not something I have ever been involved in, and if I'm honest, it's something that I've always felt very disconnected from. Policies really feel more like something that happens to you, as opposed to something that you can actually actively participate in. And often they feel like something that you aren't even considered in most of the time. And generally speaking, they are written and then they are tucked away somewhere on a website. So half the time you kind of only hear about them through word of mouth, or if it happens to be something big enough and interesting enough to be in the news, like the TEF. I have never written an HE policy. I have been part of kind of internal policy making, mainly in the consultation side of things, so as somebody sort of being consulted, but I have never written a policy, I've never okayed a policy or anything like that. I've never been part of anything of that nature. To be honest, I don't really have any ideas on how HE policy is created, mainly because I really don't understand how they are created. So things like TEF, I know that that's some sort of government decision that's probably based on some sort of thinking somewhere, somehow, or some boardroom meeting that they have that decides what happens with these things. But to be honest, I've never fully understood it. I've always kind of thought of it as not really being a very transparent process anyway, whether they're made internally or externally. I've never really understood the process by which they are made, or how you can get involved in how they are made, or anything like that. And to be quite honest with you, they often seem to be made by people who are so far removed from the effects of those policies. There's often very little consultation, and even if there is, to what extent you can actually influence those policies seems to differ. Look at the TEF, they asked for feedback, we provided feedback, but how much of that has actually been taken into account anyway? I think a very limited amount. I think this is a point where we have to be very cautious. I think HE policy can in many ways sort of increase consistency and parity, which is a good thing. I also think that we have to be cautious that we don't cause a sort of lack of creativity or innovation, particularly when those policies relate to teaching and assessment and that sort of thing. When I understand that there are certain legal requirements that probably some of these policies make sure that we adhere to, but some of the times I wonder whether or not those introductions either allow people to or stop people from being creative, or allow people to almost say, well, policy says I can't do this, so I'm not going to, or policy makes it far more difficult for me to be able to do this, and so I'm not going to do it. And so policies, as far as I can tell, seem to always be in paper form. They're often pages and pages of sort of incomprehensible language, which frankly, unless you are completely fluent in the kind of area that they're talking about, is completely inaccessible to you. And to be honest, it kind of feels like they're written in the most sort of verbose and kind of tedious language that they possibly can be, so that actually you never get to the end of it, because why the hell would you? You're bored out of your mind. I understand that there are certain sort of legal things and constraints on the language, and they have to be very careful about the way that they phrase things, but often, it feels like they're written solely for the people who have written the policy, not written for people to actually read. Which makes them really difficult to access, I think. I do, but obviously there is a risk sometimes that visual methods can kind of dilute policies, because generally sort of visual methods are there for summaries. You wouldn't, for example, have somebody sat there reading several hundred pages of policy in a video, because you're no more likely to watch that video than you are to read the paper. So it doesn't really seem like that would be a way around it. The content, when you create something like a video, or you create something like that, you generally try and summarise and sort of boil it down to its most important points. And obviously that's good in one sense, in that you get a sort of condensed version of the policy, but actually sometimes perhaps you're missing some of the other important points as well that are around the policy. I think TEF shows the need to reevaluate the way in which HE policy is created and presented. I tried to read the green paper and then subsequently the white paper, but I just couldn't get through either of them. I just found it completely incomprehensible. I didn't understand the language that they were using. I didn't, it was so long, I just couldn't bear to read it. Some of it was completely unrelated to me, so it just seemed really pointless. And I don't really think it's something that the average member of staff could understand. I couldn't just pick it up and read it, and I wouldn't imagine there are many members of staff that could just pick it up and read it and fully understand it. In fact, I've actually relied mostly on sort of the summaries and opinions of bloggers and people in newspapers to really understand what's going on there. And as a result of that, there's a good likelihood that I completely misunderstand the whole TEF thing anyway. I think using visual methods will change the way that universities think about the information, the messages that they are sending out. Visual methods generally require a really creative approach. They're really not very easy. It's much easier just to write an essay, or much easier just to write a policy. Particularly where you're summarising materials and making messages more concise. You have to make sure that the message is still there, but you're being concise enough that it's not a really tedious long video. And also tone becomes more important as well. So in a piece of paper you can't really read tone, whereas in a video you can, or other you don't want to make something look jovial when it's actually very serious, for example. And I think they'll have to think carefully about their communication strategies for those kind of things in general. When a new policy comes in, how do we absolutely make sure that every member of staff for whom it's relevant actually knows about it? Because at the moment, I really don't think that happens. And I would say that creating materials utilising visual methods is very time consuming. So again, it will make universities think a lot more deeply about how they're sending out their messages, as the universities will have to ensure that the kind of effort to make those resources actually has and reaps some reward.